They thought they had him cornered, until the entire medbay went into lockdown at his smile. 6 arms, 6 weapons, one very small room. I counted the exits the same way I count everything, quietly, while appearing to do nothing at all. There were 2 doors, both sealed before I even finished my first breath inside the med bay. The lock indicators turned red in sequence, left to right, like a slow blink, the kind of blink that means, you are not leaving. My name is Marcus Hale. I am 34 years old. I have a mild caffeine dependency, a scar on my left collarbone from a training accident at 19, and apparently, according to the official Galactic Concord arrest warrant currently being read aloud to me in a language that sounds like gravel falling downstairs, I am a criminal of the highest order. I did not look at the warrant. I looked at the room. The med bay on Kael'thas 9 was not designed for drama. It was designed for healing. Long rows of treatment beds with soft amber lighting, walls lined with sealed equipment cabinets, a central surgical console shaped like a curved glass desk, and in the far corner, a pale blue terminal that hummed at a frequency most species found soothing. I did not find it soothing. I found it very, very useful. The Velthervi Inquisitor standing 3 meters in front of me was called Executor Dral. I knew his name because I had studied him for 11 days before this moment. He was tall even by Velthari standards, nearly 2.5 meters of layered gray-blue muscle, 6 arms folded in the specific configuration that meant authority in their culture, and a face that had not changed expression in the entire time I had known of his existence. Flat eyes, a ridge of bone above each one, a mouth that barely moved when he spoke, because the Velthari communicate most of their meaning through vibration and scent, and speech is something they do mainly for the benefit of lesser species. I qualified as a lesser species. He had made that clear approximately 40 seconds ago when he called me, in standard galactic common, a fragile biological curiosity playing at intelligence. I did not take it personally. I had been called worse. Sergeant Marcus Hale, Dral said again, and this time his voice dropped to the low resonant register that made the equipment cabinets rattle slightly in their frames. You are in possession of restricted biotech classified under Concord Directive 74. You have been operating without diplomatic sanction for the past 19 days. You have accessed restricted areas of this station on 6 separate occasions. You will surrender the drive now, and then you will answer our questions, and then we will decide what remains of your future. He had a very organized way of threatening people. I appreciated that. The 6 guards around me were positioned well, 2 at my back near the sealed entrance doors, 2 flanking me at the sides, close enough that any movement from me would be met immediately. 1 at the far wall near the emergency exit, and 1, the youngest by the look of its smaller frame and the slightly uncertain way it held its weapon, standing to the left of Executor Dral, himself as if assigned to protect him personally. I noticed the young one kept glancing at the walls, not at me, at the walls. I filed that away. The drive, Dral said. I reached slowly into the inner lining of my jacket and produced a small rectangular data drive no larger than my thumb. Matte gray, no visible markings. I held it at shoulder height so all 6 guards could see it clearly. He asked, "This one, okay?" I said. "Just checking." I did not hand it over. I held it for another moment, turning it slightly between my fingers, and I looked at the room one more time. The surgical console, the equipment cabinets, the quarantine AI terminal in the corner, still humming, its pale blue light steady and patient and waiting. 3 weeks ago I had arrived on Kael'thas 9 as a diplomatic logistics coordinator. That was my official role. My unofficial role, the one that existed only in a sealed communication thread between me, my commanding officer Lieutenant Colonel Diane Yates back on Earth, and one other person who was no longer alive to know how this ended, was to obtain proof of something the Concord had been doing quietly for 6 years, not loudly, not obviously, just slowly, methodically, and with the kind of institutional confidence that comes from knowing no one is watching. What was on that drive was not biotech. It was a record. Personnel files, transfer orders, financial allocations, internal directives. 47 separate pieces of documentation that, taken together, formed a picture of a Concord authority structure that had been systematically removing human-affiliated researchers, diplomats, and technical staff from positions of influence across 9 stations and 14 treaty zones, not arresting them, not charging them, just quietly reassigning them to nowhere, or labeling their work classified, or in 3 cases, arranging accidents that were logged as equipment failure. One of those 3 cases was a xenobiologist named Dr. Lena Ward. She was 29 years old. She had discovered something in a tissue sample from a newly contacted species that contradicted a core Concord biological classification, a classification that, if corrected, would have required a major renegotiation of territorial rights in the outer systems. She had filed a report. Then she had filed a second report when the first was ignored. Then she had filed a third, and 2 weeks later, the equipment in her research bay had experienced a catastrophic pressure failure. The official investigation lasted 4 days and found no evidence of tampering. I had been finding evidence for 3 weeks. The drive in my hand contained all of it. Executor Drawl took a slow step toward me. "You are testing my patience, human." "I'm sorry," I said, and I genuinely meant it in the sense that I was aware this was an unpleasant situation for everyone involved. I just wanted to make sure we were talking about the same thing. "Give me the drive." I looked at him. I looked at the 6 guards. I looked at the young one, who was still watching the walls. And I thought about how the atmospheric scrubbers in a sealed med bay work, and what happens to a species that relies on shared signals for coordination when those signals are disrupted, and whether 11 days of studying a Velthari hive communication pattern was enough to know that what I needed from this moment was not escape. What I needed was time. I put the drive back in my jacket. The nearest guard moved immediately as expected. A hand, 3-fingered, incredibly strong, closed around my left wrist. Another hand from the same guard took my right. 2 more guards stepped inward from the sides. I let it happen. I stood very still, and I let them take everything they could find. The small blade in my boot, the second comm unit clipped inside my collar, the emergency flare pen from my back pocket. They were thorough. They were trained. They found 9 items. They did not find the subdermal tap under the nail bed of my left thumb. It was the size of a grain of rice, and it had been placed there by a field medic in a back room on a station 4 months ago, with no official record of the procedure. It had no transmitter of its own. It did not broadcast anything on its own. It did nothing by itself, except monitor and log. But it could send a signal to any device it had been introduced to, within a range of 4 meters. I had introduced it to the medbay's quarantine AI terminal on my second visit to this room, 10 days ago, when I had been here officially for a routine diplomatic health screening. I had stood close to that terminal for approximately 90 seconds while the station's medic scanned my blood pressure, and in those 90 seconds the tap had handshaked silently with the terminal's secondary input register, the one designed to accept patient, biometric data, and I had begun feeding it a very specific, very carefully constructed sequence of information. Not fake information, real information. My real biometric readings, logged every hour, building a baseline, and layered into that baseline starting 5 days ago, a slow and entirely authentic biochemical profile, elevated adrenaline, elevated cortisol, trace respiratory compounds that the terminal's diagnostic library associated with exposure to a classified pathogen last documented in a Concord biosafety incident 8 years ago. I had not been exposed to that pathogen, but I had, over 5 days of carefully controlled stress responses, exercise, controlled breathing patterns, specific dietary inputs, produced the physiological signature of someone who had been. The quarantine AI was very good at its job. It had been watching my data for days. It had not triggered yet because the threshold was not yet crossed. But the threshold was a number, and I knew the number, and I had spent the last 3 weeks doing the math. Executor Drawl held the data drive up between 2 fingers and studied it. His flat eyes reflected the amber light of the room. Around me, the 6 guards had settled back into their positions, satisfied that I was now unarmed and contained. 30 seconds, Drawl said without looking at me. "Tell me who else knows what is on this drive." I looked at him. I thought about Lena Ward. I thought about the 3 weeks I had spent on this station eating poor food and sleeping in 4-hour intervals and building something that could not be undone once it started. And then I did something that I understood would alarm him far more than shouting, or struggling, or any of the things a cornered person is supposed to do. I smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the small, quiet kind. The kind that comes from knowing something the other person does not know yet, and knowing that the moment they find out, everything in the room is going to change. The kind of smile that is not a challenge, it is a countdown. Drawl's flat eyes shifted. Not fear. The Velthari do not show fear in their faces, but something close to the biological equivalent of recalculating. "I was hoping you'd give me that long," I said. And then every alarm in the med bay went off at once. The lockdown klaxon did not sound like a siren. It sounded like the station itself inhaling sharply. A deep, resonant pulse that traveled through the floor and up through the soles of my boots and into my chest. 1 second of that sound, and then every door in the med bay sealed with a heavy mechanical thunk that I felt more than heard. The amber lighting shifted to a cool, clinical white. The pale blue terminal in the corner changed color, deep orange, the universal Concord indicator for quarantine-level biological containment. I stood exactly where I was. I did not move. I did not run toward a door or reach for anything or shout. I just breathed slowly and let the next 30 seconds happen around me. The Velthari guards broke formation. Not by much and not for long. They were trained, and they recovered quickly. But in those first seconds of the klaxon, the hive mind that coordinated their responses hiccuped. The disruption was small, but I had planned for small. Executor Drawl did not break formation. He turned in a slow, precise rotation, surveying the room, and then he turned back to me. His expression had not changed. His posture had. The 6 arms that had been folded in the configuration for authority shifted into something else. Something that in my 11 days of study I had cataloged as assessment under threat. You triggered the quarantine system, he said. The quarantine system triggered itself, I said. I'm patient 0 apparently. This was true. The quarantine AI had reviewed my biometric data, cross-referenced it against its pathogen library, noted the specific biochemical signature I had been building for 5 days, and made its own independent decision. That decision was, seal the room, engage atmospheric scrubbers, lock all communications, and classify the highest biometric risk individual in the room, me, as a confirmed exposure case. I had not hacked the system. I had not overridden anything. I had simply given a very sophisticated piece of medical software exactly the kind of information it was designed to act on, and I had trusted it to do its job. It had done its job magnificently. Override the lockdown, Drawl said. I can't, I said. The AI has full autonomy during a quarantine event. No individual user can override it. That's in the station charter. I've read the station charter. I'm guessing your legal team has too. Drawl looked at the terminal. The terminal pulsed orange, steady as a heartbeat. The lockdown will also have isolated the station's external communications, I continued, because I believed in being clear. Anything transmitted into or out of Kael'thas 9 right now is being held in a signal buffer. Station protocol. Nothing goes out until the quarantine is cleared. Could be a few hours, could be longer. There was a pause. Then one of the guards, the one on my left, a larger specimen with a single scar running along its upper arm, made a low sound in the back of its chest. The sound that in Velthari corresponds to a request for orders. Drawl raised one hand, silence. He was thinking. I took a slow step to the side, toward the nearest treatment bed, and sat down on its edge. No one stopped me. The urgency of preventing my movement had been temporarily overwritten by the urgency of processing what had just happened to the room. You've had time to plan this, Drawl said finally. 3 weeks, I confirmed. 19 days, technically. I arrived on a Tuesday. You are not frightened. I considered this. I'm quite frightened, I said honestly. I'm just not frightened of you specifically. That was also true. What I was frightened of was the math. The lockdown had sealed the station's signal buffer, which meant that anything I needed to transmit was sitting in that buffer right now, waiting. The buffer would release when the quarantine cleared. But the quarantine clearance was not in my hands. It was in the AI's hands, and the AI had its own timeline. What I had set up 3 days ago, on my 4th visit to this room, during a follow-up health screening I had specifically requested by complaining of minor respiratory symptoms, was a transmission file, not a live transmission, a queued one sitting in the station's outgoing buffer, flagged with my diplomatic credentials and addressed to 6 independent outer relay stations simultaneously. The transmission contained everything on the data drive, all 47 documents, with a full index and authentication codes. The file had been placed in the buffer before any of this began. Before the arrest, before the medbay, before Executor Drawl and his 6 guards and the small rectangle of evidence currently sitting inside my jacket, which meant the only question now was whether the buffer would release before anyone found and deleted it. And the answer to that question was, not as long as the lockdown held. Drawl was looking at me the way a very experienced person looks at a situation they are not sure they understand, yet. It was a look I had seen before on other faces, in other rooms. It is the look that precedes either a negotiation or an escalation, and which one comes first usually depends on who blinks. I did not blink. I reached into my jacket, took out the data drive, and set it on the treatment bed beside me. You might as well have it, I said. That one's a copy. Drawl's eyes moved to the drive, back to me. The original data, I said, transmitted the moment the lockdown sealed the station's signal buffer. Automated. It's already in the queue. 6 outer relay destinations. It will release when the quarantine clears. I folded my hands in my lap. We have some time. I thought we might talk. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I had experienced in my adult life. Drawl was motionless. The guards were motionless. Even the atmospheric scrubbers seemed to pause, though that was obviously not true. They were cycling at precisely 2.4 times their normal rate. which was producing a very faint shift in the room's chemical composition, which was doing very specific things to the coordination capacity of 6 Velthari, who depended on shared chemical signals to think collectively. Draal crossed the room in 4 steps, picked up the copy drive, and broke it in half between his fingers. The plastic and circuitry gave with a clean snap. He held the 2 pieces. He looked at me. "You don't believe me," I said. "I believe," he said slowly, "that you are lying, that there is no original, that you had one drive and you have just watched me destroy it, and you are now attempting to construct a fiction that preserves the appearance of control." "That's a reasonable thing to think," I said. "I would probably think the same thing." "Then you admit." "I admit nothing. I'm saying that the scenario you've described is consistent with what you're seeing, and I understand why you'd land there." I looked at the broken drive in his hands. "I also think that if you were 100% certain I was bluffing, you wouldn't have broken it quite that fast. You would have questioned me first." His jaw tightened, slightly. The young guard, the small one, stationed to the left of Draal, made a subtle movement, not aggressive, just a small shift of weight, like a person unconsciously leaning in to hear something better. I noticed it. I did not react to it yet, but I looked briefly at its face. Its eyes were moving. Not toward the exits, not toward me with threat, not toward Draal for orders. It was looking at the orange terminal, curious. It was trying to understand what the machine was doing and why, on its own, without waiting for the hive mind to process the question first and distribute the answer. That was not normal Velthari behavior. That was what happened when the chemical coordination was interrupted, and an individual mind was left, briefly, to operate by itself. I had hoped for this, but hope and planning are not the same thing. This one surprised me. "So we talked," Draal said. His voice had settled back into its flat authority register. "You want to talk? Very well. Tell me who else on this station assisted you." "No one," I said. "I work alone. Earth Command did my sanction this operation. I went off protocol 19 days ago." "Why?" I looked at the wall for a moment. There was a standard issue station clock above the sealed exit door. I watched it complete one full cycle of its second indicator before I answered. "Do you know the name Lena Ward?" I asked. Draal said nothing. "She was a zezomyologist," I said. 29 years old. She was stationed on Relay Post 11 in the Karev system. She found something in a tissue sample that your administrative body did not want found. Not because it was dangerous, because it was inconvenient. I kept my voice level. Not angry, just clear. She filled 3 reports. Then the pressure seals in her research bay failed. The official investigation lasted 4 days. Equipment failures. Do not happen to 3 specific researchers in 14 months, I said, who each discovered something inconvenient for the same administrative body, on stations that each logged unusual maintenance requests through the same internal contractor in the 72 hours before the incidents. Draal set the pieces of the broken drive on the surgical console. "You have no evidence of coordination," he said. "I have 47 documents that say otherwise," I said, "and they are currently sitting in a signal buffer waiting for a quarantine AI to clear them for transmission." The orange terminal pulsed behind him. I reached into my boot and produced the protein bar I had been carrying since morning. I unwrapped it slowly, because I had not eaten since before the arrest, and because there is something specifically infuriating to an adversary about a person who eats calmly during a confrontation. Not to be dramatic, just because it was true that I was hungry. The young guard, the small one, watched me do this with an expression I could only describe as fascinated. "We have several hours," I said, breaking off a piece. "I'd like to talk about what's on those documents. I'd like you to hear the argument before the transmission clears. Not because it will stop anything, it won't, but because I think you are not a stupid individual executor. And I think that if you understand what this actually is, you might make different choices about what happens in this room for the next few hours." Draal looked at me for a long moment. "You believe," he said finally, "that you can change my mind?" "No," I said. "I believe I can give you information you don't currently have. What you do with it is your choice." I took a bite. That's always been the point. The orbital clock on the wall completed another cycle. Outside the sealed doors, Kael'thos 9 continued its slow rotation around a pale outer system star that did not care, one way or the other, what was happening inside a locked med bay in its orbit. Inside, I ate a protein bar and waited, and the quarantine AI pulsed orange, steady and patient and absolutely in no hurry at all. The Conquered had existed for 112 years. Executor Draal told me this, not because I asked, but because he clearly believed the information was relevant, that the weight of a century should mean something to a species that had been part of the Concord for only 11 years. 112 years, he said. of maintained stability across 43 treaty zones. And in those 112 years, I said, how many researchers disappeared? He did not answer. We had been talking for 1 hour and 40 minutes. I knew this because I kept watching the clock. Not obviously. I was careful about that. But the clock was in my direct line of sight from the treatment bed, and every time I glanced toward the far wall I could read it. And I kept a running count in the back of my mind the way I keep most things. Quietly, while appearing to think about something else. The 6 guards had arranged themselves in a loose perimeter around the room, not the tight formation they had held at the beginning. The atmospheric shift had made that precise coordination difficult to maintain, and they had drifted into a more comfortable spread. The scarred one near the left wall had sat down on the edge of a second treatment bed, its weapon resting across its knees. 2 near the main door were leaning against the wall. The posture was still alert, but the collective urgency had softened. The hive mind was functioning at reduced capacity, and reduced capacity meant reduced coordination, and reduced coordination meant that each individual was making small physical decisions. Where to stand, whether to sit, how tightly to hold a weapon, more independently than they were used to. The young one, the small guard, designation VETH-7 according to the ID marker on its collar, had not moved from its position beside Drawl, but it had stopped watching the walls and started watching me, not with hostility, with the specific quality of attention. That means someone is listening to understand something, rather than listening to prepare a counter-argument. I had noticed. I had continued talking. The Krev reclassification, Drawl said, would have required a renegotiation of 6 territorial boundaries, the disruption to existing populations, the displacement, the resource reallocation, would have caused measurable harm to 300,000 individuals across 2 species. That is a true statement, I said, and I want to be fair to the argument, because it is not a stupid argument. If the only choice is between 1 researcher and 300,000 people, I understand the math. Then you understand. I understand the math, I said again, but that is not the only choice. The only reason it looked like the only choice is because the decision was made in secret, by people who did not allow the alternative options to be developed. Lena Ward was not asking for an immediate renegotiation. She was asking for a review, a formal scientific review. That process takes years. It involves consultation. It involves the affected populations. It is slow and difficult, and it does not produce clean answers quickly. I paused. But it does not involve people dying. Drawl's posture remained fixed. But I had learned something in the past 90 minutes of watching him. He had a tell. When he was genuinely processing an argument he had not fully anticipated, his upper right arm, the one close to his body, moved very slightly outward. A fraction. Less than 2 centimeters. It happened now, I continued. The documents on that drive include internal communications from the administrative body responsible for the Karev reclassification decision, not the public-facing decision. The internal discussion, the messages between the people who made the choice. I kept my voice level. They are not monsters. That is what makes it complicated. They are administrators who believed they were protecting stability. They used language like prudent management and long-term harmonic balance. They convinced themselves that a quiet solution was a kind solution. And you disagree. I disagree that the decision was theirs to make, I said, without oversight, without review, without the knowledge of anyone outside their circle. I looked at the orange terminal. That is what the Concorde was built to prevent, 112 years ago. By people who understood exactly what happens when small groups make large decisions in the dark. There was a long pause. VETH-7 shifted. Its eyes. They moved from me to Drawl, and then back to me, and then to the terminal, and then to the broken pieces of the copy drive on the surgical console. You are attempting to reframe this as a principled stand, Drawl said. It is not. You have broken treaty law. You have accessed restricted systems. You have deliberately triggered a quarantine response in a medical facility. Yes, I said, I have. You do not deny it. I'm not here to deny anything. I'm here because a 29-year-old scientist died in a preventable accident, and because the people responsible for that accident are in those documents, and because I am the person who found out and had the means to do something about it. I looked at him steadily. That is the full truth of why I am in this room. You can disagree with my methods. That is fair. But you cannot tell me the cause is wrong. Drawl was quiet. Then from outside, from beyond the sealed doors, conducted faintly through the hull plating, a vipanical, deep, repetitive. I recognized it immediately because I had memorized the station's operational manual on my 3rd day aboard Kalthos 9. Docking clamp disengagement. External sequence. The Concorde was physically isolating the station. I did not let this show on my face. Not a flicker. Because what Drawl did not know, what I needed him not to know for at least the next few minutes, was that the external clamp disengagement also affected the relay node on the station's outer hull. And the relay node was what the signal buffer connected to. And if the relay node was physically severed before the buffer cleared the quarantine lockdown, my jaw tightened once, and I relaxed it deliberately. "You're cutting us off," I said, mild tone. "Informational. Standard isolation protocol for a station under criminal investigation," Drawl said. "It also severs your transmission queue." I looked at him. "You did not know," he said. "I was aware it was a possibility," I said carefully. That was true. I had assigned the probability at 12%. I had been wrong. Drawl's posture changed. The authority configuration returned. The small outward movement of his upper right arm reversed. That arm folded back in, tighter than before. He believed he had recovered something. "The external relay node will be physically disconnected in approximately 40 minutes, he said. "After which the buffer clears to nothing. Your transmission dies, and then we will discuss what happens to you." He paused. "I would suggest using these 40 minutes to make better decisions than you have made so far." I was quiet. Veth 7 was watching me. Just watching. Not with triumph the way the others were watching. With something that I could only describe, in human terms, as concern. It was a strange thing to see on the face of an alien guard in a locked room. I picked up the wrapper from the protein bar and folded it in my hands. Under the wrapper, protected by the foil, pressed flat and carried for 3 weeks in the same boot as the protein bar, was a photograph. Small, creased at the corners. A young woman in a lab coat standing in front of a research console, laughing at something off camera, her hair escaping its pin in about 4 directions. I did not take it out. I just held the wrapper. "You asked who else knows what's on the drive," I said. Drawl waited. "The people it was going to," I said. "They don't know yet. They will know when the buffer clears, if the buffer clears." I set the wrapper down. "But there is one other person who knew. She found the original data. She documented it. She filed 3 reports." I looked at the clock. 38 minutes remaining on Drawl's timeline. "You know her name," I said. "You have it in your incident files under equipment failure. I'd like you to say it." Drawl said nothing. "Lena Ward," I said. She was 29 years old. She was good at her job. She was thorough and careful, and she believed that the system she worked inside would protect her if she did the right thing. I kept my voice steady. The system did not protect her. The orange terminal pulsed. Veth 7's weapon, without any order being given, lowered by approximately 15 degrees. I noticed. I did not say anything about it yet, but I noticed. 38 minutes, Drawl said. "Talk about something useful." "All right," I said. "Let's talk about the Concorde's justification for what's on those documents. You gave me the argument earlier. Stability across 43 treaty zones. I want to give you my full response, and I want you to actually hear it. Not to prepare a rebuttal. Just to hear it." I leaned forward slightly on the treatment bed. "Can you do that?" Drawl's upper right arm moved. Slightly outward. "Speak," he said. And I spoke. Had 38 minutes and 1 argument and 1 young guard who was listening to understand rather than to obey. In this specific combination of circumstances, 38 minutes was enough. I had 38 minutes and a problem I had not solved. Let me be honest about that. The plans I make are good plans. I am careful. I do the math, I account for variables, I build in margins. I have been doing this long enough to know the difference between a risk I have measured and a risk I have missed. The relay node was a missed risk. A 12% probability that I had acknowledged on paper and then set aside, because 12% felt small and because I had needed focus on everything else, and now 12% was the entire room. I kept talking. I had to. The talking was still the plan, or the part of the plan that remained. Every minute I held Drawl in conversation was a minute the buffer sat untouched. A minute the relay node stayed connected. A minute the odds of clearance before disconnection stayed alive. So I talked. But in the part of my mind that I keep separate from the words, the quiet part, the part that runs its own calculations while the rest of me is doing something else. I was working a problem with no clean solution. The quarantine AI had full lockdown authority, no individual override. That was the truth, but the AI had one input I had not used yet. A manual emergency broadcast signal from the medbay's internal system, which if properly authenticated, could trigger an immediate external relay burst regardless of quarantine status. It was a safety feature, designed for catastrophic medical emergencies where lives depended on instant outside contact. I knew about it. I had read the manual. I had assessed it as a last resort. The problem was the authentication. The manual broadcast required a verified medical personnel code. I was not medical personnel. My diplomatic credentials would not work. And the authentication terminal was at the far end of the room, near the sealed emergency exit, behind the guard who had been standing there the entire time. I could not reach it, not physically, not with 6 guards in the room. I talked. I laid out the argument against the Concorde's internal justification the way I had rehearsed it in my head, over 19 days on this station. Not emotionally. I have learned that emotion closes doors in certain types of minds, and Dral's mind was structured around logic and hierarchy and the long view. So I gave him the long view back, restructured. A system that makes decisions in secret, I said, is not stable. It is brittle. Stability built on concealed information is not stability. It is pressure contained by a structure that cannot acknowledge the pressure. Every decision made this way adds to that pressure. At some point the structure does not hold. Dral listened. His upper right arm moved. Outward, then back, then outward again. He was genuinely engaging with this, which was not the same as agreeing, but it was what I needed. The clock ran down. 22 minutes. 15. The Concorde's founding documents, I said, include a principle called transparent arbitration. Every treaty, every reclassification, every territorial decision, subject to open review by any affected party upon request. It is the first principle listed. It is the reason 64 species signed the original charter. Theory and practice are different things when the practice has been documented. In 47 files and authenticated by 6 independent forensic protocols, I said, which is what is in the buffer. That is not a theory. That is a record. 11 minutes. Dral turned his head toward the emergency broadcast terminal at the far end of the room. I watched him turn his head. He was thinking about the same thing I was thinking about. Guard 7, he said. It was not a name. It was a designation. He was addressing Veth 7, the young one. Access the emergency broadcast terminal. Authenticate with enforcement codes Sigma 14 and initiate an outgoing buffer override. I went still. A buffer override. Not a deletion. They could not delete without physical access to the relay node. But an override would place a new signal at the front of the queue, ahead of mine, and that new signal would be a shutdown command for the relay node itself. The node would cut power before my transmission cleared. The buffer would release into nothing. Veth 7 did not move. Dral repeated the instruction. Veth 7 looked at me, then at the terminal, then at the broken drive pieces on the surgical console. Guard 7, Dral said. And this time his voice dropped into the command frequency. The Hive directive register I had cataloged as the signal that normally produced immediate compliance without individual processing. Execute. Veth 7, one step forward. I stood up. 2 guards moved toward me instantly, hands on my shoulders, pushing down. I let them push me down and I kept my eyes on Veth 7. You have been listening, I said to it, because I was out of other options and honesty is sometimes the only tool left. For an hour and a half, you have been listening and I have watched you thinking. Not receiving instructions, thinking by yourself. Veth 7 stopped. Dral's command frequency rose. I could feel the vibration of it in my back teeth. The other 5 guards stiffened toward full alert. The 2 holding me tightened their grip. Whatever the hive mind tells you about what that means, I said to Veth 7. Whatever it calls that experience. Whatever word it uses for an individual deciding something for themselves. That experience is real. What you just felt is real, and the question you are currently deciding is real. Veth 7 was motionless. Lena Ward filed 3 reports, I said. She had the same choice you have right now. She chose to keep going. I held Veth 7's gaze as steadily as I could. I am asking you to make a different choice than the one your Inquisitor is ordering. Not for me. For what the Concorde is supposed to be. 8 minutes. Dral took 3 steps across the room, bypassing Veth 7 entirely, and placed his hand on the emergency broadcast terminal's authentication panel. And then Veth 7 stepped in front of it. It did not reach for its weapon. It did not attack anyone. It did not make a sound. It simply moved to stand directly between Executor Dral and the terminal, its back to the panel, its arms at its sides. The room went completely silent. Dral stared at Veth 7. The expression on his face was something I did not have a catalog entry for. Something between fury and incomprehension, and a grief that I had not expected from him. A grief that looked like watching something beloved break. I moved. The guards holding me had both shifted their attention to Veth 7, a fraction of a second of collective reorientation, and I used it. I did not fight them. I simply moved forward with enough speed that their grips slid to my elbows instead of my shoulders, and I covered the distance to the terminal in 4 steps and put both hands on the authentication panel. I did not have a medical personnel code. But what I had placed in this terminal's secondary input register 10 days ago, via the subdermal tap, in the 90 seconds of a routine health screening, was a pre-authenticated emergency transmission packet, not a live signal, a stored one, attached to a biosafety protocol that allowed any patient in a confirmed quarantine event to trigger an external medical distress burst without personnel codes, because the designers of this system had understood that in a genuine emergency, patients might be the only people in the room. I pressed the patient trigger function. The terminal asked me to confirm. I confirmed. And then the med bay's emergency broadcast system gave everything it had, every watt of transmission power available to a station-class medical facility, focused through the relay node in a single sustained burst, and the buffer cleared. Not partially, not in sequence. All of it. Simultaneously. Every document, every file, every piece of evidence authenticated and tagged with the station coordinates and the timestamp and my credentials and Lena Ward's name at the top of the index, to 6 relay stations at once. The broadcast system burned out immediately after. Every indicator on the terminal went dark. The panel under my hands went cold. The hum that had been present in that machine since I first walked into the med bay 18 days ago stopped. The room was very quiet. I took my hands off the dead terminal. I turned around. The 2 guards who had been holding me were standing 3 meters back, not moving. Drahl had not moved from the center of the room. Veth 7 was still standing with its back to the empty terminal, arms at its sides. And then, 2 short pulses, 1 long tone. The quarantine AI's signal received confirmation code played through the room's speakers. I had heard that sound exactly once before, in a recording. During a station systems briefing on my second day aboard, I had memorized it. I had spent 19 days doing everything I did so that I would hear it in person. It was a small sound, an automated confirmation from a piece of medical software. 3 tones. I closed my eyes, just for a second. Then I opened them and looked at Executor Drahl. It's done, I said. They opened the medbay 4 hours later. Not because the quarantine AI decided the biological emergency had passed. It took another 18 hours to formally clear that, because the system was thorough and did not cut corners regardless of circumstances. They opened it because Earth Command arrived. Lieutenant Colonel Diane Yates with a rapid response diplomatic team and a formal treaty enforcement order that had apparently been prepared 3 days in advance and kept in a sealed file pending the signal. She had been tracking my subdermal tap signal the entire time. She had not told me. I will have things to say to her about that at a later date. The doors unsealed from the outside with a hiss, and the first person through was a medic. Human, young, visibly relieved. Followed by 2 of Yates's team in full diplomatic credentials. And then Yates herself. She was 52 years old, gray-haired, and wearing the specific expression she reserved for situations where I had accomplished something she could not publicly endorse and privately would not have traded for anything. She looked at the room. At the guards in their positions, at Drahl standing in the center, at the dead terminal, at Veth 7 still standing to one side, at me, sitting on the treatment bed, eating the last third of a protein bar. You were supposed to wait for extraction, she said. You said that last time too, I said. She pressed her lips together in a way that was almost a smile and turned to formally address Executor Drahl. What followed was approximately 90 minutes of treaty procedure that I will not describe in full, because most of it was informal Galactic common, with legal subclauses, and I spent the majority of it sitting quietly and trying to determine whether my hands had stopped shaking yet. They had mostly stopped. Mostly. The substance of it was as follows. The data transmission had reached all 6 relay stations. It had been authenticated, cataloged, and was already being reviewed by 3 independent Concord oversight bodies who had received it simultaneously and could not, therefore, coordinate to suppress it. The individuals named in the documents had been flagged for investigation. The administrative body responsible for the Karev reclassification decision had been suspended pending inquiry. The Kalthos 9 station director, who had known nothing about any of this, I want to be clear, had already filed a formal protest about the events of the last 6 hours, which was entirely his right and which would be reviewed in due course. Drahl was taken into formal custody by Yates's team. He went without resistance. That surprised me. He was calm, actually, more calm than he had been in the room during the worst of it. As they led him toward the door, he stopped and turned to look at me one more time. He did not say anything. He looked at me for approximately 4 seconds with those flat eyes, and then he looked at Veth 7, and then he walked out. I do not know what that look meant. I have thought about it since. I think and I want to be careful about projecting human emotional logic onto a Velthari Inquisitor, I think it was the look of someone who had understood something and was not yet sure how to hold it. I hope that is what it was. Veth 7 stood in the center of the room after everyone else had moved. During the procedural exchanges and the credential checking and the controlled urgency of treaty enforcement doing its work. It stood and watched with the same quality of attention it had been using all through the previous hours. Independent, curious, processing without the hive mind filtering the information first. I walked over. "Thank you," I said. It looked at me. "I have spent enough time among non-human species to read the basic registers of Velthari expression. Not the chemical layers, not the vibration meaning, just the broadest physical signals that even an inexperienced observer would catch. What was on Veth 7's face in that moment was the register I associated with something between uncertainty and resolution. It made a sound low in its chest. Then in Galactic Common, slow and slightly formal like someone speaking a second language with care, it said, "The argument was correct." "Which part?" I asked. It considered this. "The part where the experience was real," it said. I nodded. "There is a process. I learned this from Yates's team as they were wrapping up the formal procedure. For individual Velthari seeking recognition, outside the hive structure, it is extremely rare. It had happened twice in Concord history, both cases disputed and both resulting in the individual returning to the hive within 6 months. The paperwork required, Yates told me later with a slightly tired look, was 60 pages. I told Veth 7 this. It looked at me, then it said, "How long does the paperwork take?" "I honestly don't know," I said, "but I'll help you fill it out." There was a pause. Then something happened on Veth 7's face that I had not yet seen on any Velthari face in the 6 years I had been working in Concord space. Something that started in the eyes and moved outward to the edges of the jaw and changed the quality of the light there, just slightly. It might have been a smile. I don't know. I am not an expert in Velthari facial expressions, but it looked like one. I went back to the treatment bed and sat down. The medic came and checked my biometrics properly, this time, with actual medical equipment rather than a subdermal tap quietly feeding constructed data to an AI terminal. My readings were elevated in several categories consistent with sustained high stress over a prolonged period. She gave me something for it and told me to rest. I said I would. I took the protein bar wrapper from my pocket, unwrapped it carefully, because I had folded it around something 3 weeks ago, and carried it in my boot every day since, and I wanted to make sure it had not been damaged in all the sitting and standing and being grabbed by Velthari guards. It had not been damaged. The photograph was small and creased at the corners. A young woman in a lab coat in front of a research console, laughing at something off camera, her hair coming loose in 4 directions at once. I looked at it for a while. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in my shirt pocket, close to where I keep things I don't want to lose. Yates found me there about 20 minutes later. She sat down on the treatment bed beside me, unusual for her. She generally preferred to stand, and was quiet for a moment. "The 6 relay stations have confirmed receipt," she said. "Contention passed on all 47 files. The oversight review is already public. It cannot be reversed." "Good," I said. "The 3 incidents," she said, "relay post 11 included. I know. They will be reopened as active investigations." "I know," I said again. That was the point. She was quiet for another moment. Outside the med bay, through the now open doors, the station had returned to its normal operations. The hum of life support, the movement of personnel, the ordinary business of a facility that had just experienced a very unusual morning, and was doing its best to process that sensibly. "The Concord diplomat coming in on the noon shuttle," Yates said, "is going to ask for a full debrief. I know. He's going to want to understand how one person managed to do this much damage to a century-old administrative structure from inside a locked room, with no weapons and no communications." I thought about this for a moment. I thought about 19 days of careful work, and a quarantine AI doing its job, and a young Velthari guard who decided to think for itself, and a dead terminal that had given everything it had in one single burst. I thought about a girl laughing in a lab coat, and 3 reports that no one had answered. "I had 60 seconds and a reason," I said. "Also, the room had a really good quarantine AI." Yates made the almost smile again. "You're going to have to take a desk posting for 6 months," she said. "Administrative leave, after a full debrief." "I know. You'll hate it. I know." She stood, straightened her collar, looked at me with the expression she had been wearing since she walked through that door. The one I had no clean name for, except that it was complicated and it had my name in it somewhere. "She would have wanted to know it worked," she said quietly. Not a question. "Yes," I said. "She would have." Yates nodded once. Then she went back to her team. I sat for a while longer in the med bay of Kael'thas 9, which was no longer locked. and watched the light through the corridor windows change as the station completed its slow rotation, and thought about how strange and specific and unrepeatable it is. The moment when something you have been building alone for a very long time finally becomes real. They asked me later if I had been afraid. A journalist, actually. The story was public by then, moving through relay networks faster than I had expected. I told her yes. I had been afraid every second of every one of those 19 days, and most acutely in the room itself, and most of all in the 8 minutes at the end when I was not sure it was going to work. She seemed surprised by this. She had expected something else, I think, something more certain and composed. The image of someone who had walked into that room already knowing how it would end. I told her that is not how it works. You don't know how it ends. You do the work and you make the plan and you account for the things you can account for. And then you meet the things you couldn't account for. And somewhere in all of that you find out what you are made of. She asked what the smile had been about. The one at the beginning. The one that triggered the lockdown. I had to think about that for a moment. The smile, I told her, was not because I was certain. The smile was because the plan was already running. It had been running for 3 weeks. The moment that room sealed, everything I had built was in motion. The buffer, the biometric sequence, the quarantine AI doing exactly what it was designed to do. The smile was the moment I understood that it was out of my hands now, that the work was done, that whatever came next, the thing I had come here to do was already happening. You do it because you're scared, I told her. You do it because someone has to. You smile because that is the only weapon they never think to check for. Not bravado, not certainty, but the specific piece of a person who has already done the thing and is just waiting for the world to catch up. She wrote all of that down. I do not know if she printed it exactly that way. I hope she did. Somewhere out there, 6 relay stations were processing 47 documents with a name at the top of the index. I got up, found Veth 7 waiting in the corridor with 60 pages of forms and a look of determined concentration, and sat down to help.